The anniversary cake sat untouched on the silver tray. Mrs. Halford had ordered it herself, 3 tiers of white fondant dressed with pale roses, the kind the Duchess had once mentioned, in passing, that she loved. It had been a small comment, made 2 winters ago over a cup of morning tea, and the housekeeper had filed it away with the careful devotion of a woman who understood that someone ought to remember the things the Duke did not. It was now 3:30 in the afternoon, and the Duke had not come home. Lady Alara Montclair, the Duchess of Ashenvale, mistress of this great cold house, stood at the tall window of the east drawing-room and watched the gray sky press down over the grounds. 7 years. She turned the number over in her mind, the way one turns a stone found on a riverbed, examining it for something remarkable, finding only its weight. She had arrived at Ashenvale at 19, hopeful in the particular way that only the very young and the very unguarded can manage. She had worn a cream traveling dress and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself that morning, thinking, in her naivety, that a personal touch might soften a formal introduction. Duke Selim Ashenvale had received her in the entrance hall with the warmth of a man signing a trade agreement. His eyes had moved over her once, assessing, disinterested, and he had said, "You must be tired from the journey," before handing her off to Mrs. Halford and disappearing into his study. She had stood in the entrance hall holding her wildflowers with nowhere to put them. That had been the beginning. 7 years had not softened him. If anything, time had only perfected his distance, carved it into something architectural, something that held up the structure of their arrangement like load-bearing walls. He was not cruel. She had met cruel men and knew the shape of that particular darkness. Selim Ashenvale was something harder to name. He was absent, even when present. He moved through the same rooms, breathed the same air, sat at the same long dinner table, and looked through her as though she were a feature of the house he had long since stopped noticing. A window, a wall. She had run his estate with precision and grace. She had managed the accounts, overseen the staff, hosted his political guests and his hunting parties, written his correspondence when he was indisposed, smoothed over his social abrasions with quiet diplomacy. She had done all of this without complaint and without acknowledgement, sustained by something she could no longer honestly call hope. Habit, perhaps. Duty. The brittle dignity of a woman who refuses to be seen falling apart. He had never once called her Alara. It was always my lady, when courtesy required it, or simply nothing, a look, a gesture, a silence that expected her to understand and comply. She had told herself in the early years that she did not mind. She had even believed it for a while. The dinner party 3 weeks ago had ended that. Lord Pemberton had brought guests from the continent, a countess among them, a striking woman named Lady Cressida Vane, who had arrived trailing silk and self-assurance in equal measure. Alara had arranged the seating, selected the menu, overseen the flowers and the wine. She had sat at the far end of the table in the dutiful position of a good hostess and watched Selim, her husband, the man whose name she bore, come more alive in one evening than she had witnessed in 7 years combined. He had leaned toward Lady Cressida, he had laughed. And then, at the turn of the third course, Lord Pemberton had made some remark about fate and matrimony, and Selim had gestured toward the Countess with a wine glass and said, lightly, easily, as though it were nothing, "Lady Cressida was nearly my wife, you know. Some might say fate had better taste than my father's lawyers." The table had laughed. Lady Cressida had smiled behind her glass. Alara had set down her fork very carefully and looked at the arrangement of white roses at the table's center and thought about how she had chosen them herself that morning and how they were already beginning to die. She had not wept that night. She had moved through the remainder of the evening with the composure of a woman who has already, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, made a decision. Now she stood at the window and watched the sky and let the decision rise to the surface. She was 33 years old. She had given this house her best years with the quiet generosity of someone who believed, eventually, that it would be enough. It was not enough. It would never be enough because the problem had never been her effort. The problem was that she had married a man who did not see her and in 7 years she had not managed to become visible. She was very tired. She turned from the window and moved to the writing desk in the corner, the small one, hers, not the grand mahogany structure in his study. She sat down. She chose a plain piece of paper. She did not allow herself to hesitate, because she knew that hesitation was the enemy of the only brave thing she had ever decided to do for herself. She wrote 8 sentences. Then she crossed out 5 of them. What remained was this: I have served this house faithfully. I release you and I release myself. Do not look for me. I will not be found by someone who never wished to see me. She folded it once. She wrote his title on the front, not his name, his title, and she left it on his desk. By the time the anniversary cake had dried and Mrs. Halford had finally, sadly, removed it from the silver tray, Alara was already gone. The wildflowers she had pressed on the first day she arrived, kept for 7 years in the drawer of her small desk, she left behind. She did not need them anymore. He read the letter 4 times. The first time standing. The second time seated, because his legs had decided the matter without consulting him. The third time slowly, parsing each word as though the sentence might yield something different under closer examination. The fourth time, he set it face down on the desk and did not read it again, because he understood by then that no amount of reading would change what it said or what it meant. She was gone. Selim Ashenvale sat in his study in the early morning silence and felt, for the first time in recent memory, the specific texture of a house that had stopped holding its breath. He had not known until this moment that it had been holding it at all. The quiet was different now, not the ordered, managed quiet he had grown accustomed to, but something emptier with edges. He told himself he was angry. It was easier than the alternative. By noon he had questioned the entire household staff with the focused efficiency of a man who mistakes control for composure. The kitchen maids knew nothing. The footmen knew nothing. The lady's maid, a young woman named Polly who had served Alara for 3 years, pressed her lips together and said she knew nothing with the particular firmness that meant she knew everything and intended to keep it. Mrs. Halford met his questions with an expression so carefully neutral it bordered on insubordination, answered in precise monosyllables, and excused herself before he could press further. It was Thomas, the stable boy, 16, guileless and unaware that loyalty sometimes requires silence, who told him. She had left before dawn on foot, the North Road, a small brown case, the kind a tradesman's wife might carry. She had given Thomas her favorite mare to look after, pressing the reins into his hands with a smile, and told him the horse deserved extra oats. She had not looked back. Selim stood in the stable long after Thomas finished speaking, his hand resting on the neck of the mare in question. The animal regarded him with large, liquid eyes that seemed, in his current state, faintly accusatory. He hired Inspector Graves by the end of the week. London, meanwhile, had already begun to talk. It moved through the drawing rooms and the club dining rooms and the afternoon calls with the quiet, irresistible momentum of water finding a crack. The Duchess of Ashenvale has left. People said it with the carefully arranged faces of those performing concern, while privately relishing the drama. Selim appeared at 2 social engagements and endured the tilted heads and delicate inquiries, and the particular brand of sympathy that is indistinguishable from satisfaction, and then he stopped appearing at all. Lady Cressida came to Ashenvale on the pretense of returning a book she had borrowed at the dinner party. She stood in the drawing room, Alara's drawing room, arranged according to Alara's taste, flowers selected by Alara's instruction, and spoke with the careful warmth of a woman who believes a vacancy has opened in her favor. She said the house must feel very large for one person. She said she had always admired Ashenvale's grounds. She let the implication breathe in the space between her sentences. Selim looked at her, truly looked, perhaps for the first time, and saw the architecture of her ambition so plainly that he felt faintly ashamed it had ever impressed him. He thanked her for the book and did not invite her to stay for tea. She did not come again. The journals were Mrs. Halford's doing, though she would never admit it. She had simply left them on his desk, 3 years' worth of Alara's household records, without comment or explanation. He had intended to review them for estate purposes. That intention lasted approximately 4 pages. The records were meticulous, practical, impeccably kept. But between the columns of accounts and the lists of provisions and the notes on staff schedules, there were small observations, written in Alara's small, precise hand, that had no business being as devastating as they were. The east boiler requires attention before winter. I have informed Mr. Crane twice. I will inform him a third time, though I confess I am growing weary of repeating myself into silence. And then, 3 pages later, almost as an aside, he passed me in the corridor today without acknowledgement. I wore the blue dress he once glanced at twice. I will not wear it again. Selim closed the journal, opened it, read the entry again, closed it once more and sat for a long time with his hands flat on the cover. There were others. Dozens scattered across 3 years like small, precise wounds. Hosted 14 guests this week. The Duke seemed pleased with the arrangements, or at least not displeased, which I have come to understand is the closest available approximation. I found a pressed flower in the drawer today, the wildflowers from the first day. I cannot think why I have kept them. Perhaps because they were mine, and there is little enough here that is. He did not sleep that night. Graves found her 6 weeks after her disappearance. A village called Whitmore-on-Weald, 2 days' ride northeast, small, unremarkable, the kind of place designed by geography to be overlooked. She was living under a false name, working as a seamstress. The Reverend Aldous, who knew her true identity, had kept her secret with the serene impregnability of a man at peace with God and unbothered by dukes. Selim dismissed Graves at the village boundary. He rode the last mile alone in the last gray hour before dusk settled fully and found the shop without difficulty, a warm square of candlelight on a dark street. Through the glass he saw her. She was bent over her work, needle moving in steady rhythm, entirely unaware of his presence. She looked, and this struck him with the force of something long suppressed finally breaking surface, calm. Not the managed composure he had watched her perform across 100 dinner tables. Something genuine, something that had apparently been there all along, waiting for sufficient space to breathe. He did not go in. He stood in the cold street with his hand raised toward the door and understood, with a clarity that arrived too late and counted for nothing yet, exactly what 7 years of his cowardice had cost her. He stood there for a long time. The candle burned steadily inside. He took a room at the inn under the name Mr. Ashford. The innkeeper's wife asked no questions, which suited him. He paid for a week in advance, carried his own bag up the narrow staircase, and sat on the edge of a bed considerably less grand than anything he had slept on in 20 years. He did not find this uncomfortable. He found it, strangely, appropriate, as though the smallness of the room matched something that had recently become small and honest inside him. He was not ready to face her. Not yet. Not until he understood what he intended to say, and whether he had any right to say it. So he watched. He watched from a distance that felt both cowardly and necessary, telling himself he was simply ensuring she was safe, knowing that was only partially true. Each morning she emerged from the narrow doorway of her lodgings above the seamstress shop, punctual, unhurried, wrapped in a plain gray coat he had never seen before, purchased with money she had earned herself. She walked to the market square with the measured ease of a woman who has recently rediscovered the pleasure of moving through the world at her own pace. She laughed on the 3rd morning, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, prompted by something the merchant's wife said over a basket of early vegetables. The sound reached him across the square and did something to his chest that he did not have adequate vocabulary for. On the 4th afternoon, he watched her sit with a young girl outside the shop, guiding small hands through the mechanics of embroidery with a patience that was entirely unhurried. The girl made errors. Alara corrected them gently, without the faint tightening around the eyes that social performance requires. She was not performing anything. That was what undid him, finally and completely. She was simply herself. In a way he now understood she had never been permitted to be inside his house. He had permitted nothing. He had simply never looked. On the fifth morning she saw him. It happened without drama, no gasp, no stumble, no dropped basket from a surprised supporting character. Their eyes met across the market square with the clean, terrible directness of two people who have run out of the architecture that once kept them safely apart. She went very still. He did not move. Around them, the village continued its ordinary morning business, entirely indifferent to the 7 years suspended in the 15 feet of cold air between them. She found him that evening at the inn. She came alone, without announcement, and sat down across from him at the small table by the window with the composure of a woman who has decided exactly how much of herself she is willing to spend on this conversation. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him directly, something she had learned, he realized, or perhaps always known, and simply stopped attempting. "You have found me, Your Grace," she said. "What is it you intend to do with that?" He had rehearsed something. It dissolved entirely on contact with her steadiness. What came out instead was the truth, which arrived in pieces, haltingly, without the polished authority he had spent a lifetime projecting. He told her that the house had stopped functioning without her, not the practical machinery of it, but something essential he had no name for until its absence made naming irrelevant. He told her about the journals. He watched something flicker across her face at that. Not quite pain, not quite satisfaction, something more complex than either. He told her that Lady Cressida had come, and that seeing her had clarified something he should have understood years before he did. Then he stopped arranging words and said the thing beneath all the other things. "I was afraid," he said. "Not of you. Of needing you. I mistook that fear for indifference, and I wore it like a principle, and I let you carry everything I was too proud to reach for, and I did not understand what I was doing until you were gone, and the understanding was worth nothing." The silence that followed was the longest of his life. "You left a letter," she said finally. "On our wedding night, do you remember? You slid it under the connecting door. It said only that you hoped I found Ashenvale comfortable and that breakfast was served at 8. She paused. "I kept it. I read it sometimes when I needed to remember that what existed between us was a transaction, and not a failure of my own making." He said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. "I have built something here," she continued. "It is small and unglamorous, and it is entirely mine. You should understand what you are asking me to abandon before you ask it." "I am not asking you to abandon it," he said. "I am asking you only this, to allow me to be known by you. The way I now know you deserve to be known from the beginning. I am not here to retrieve you. I am here because I could not find a single sufficient reason to stay away." She looked at him for a long time. The candle between them burned low. "If I return," she said slowly, "I will not return as a ghost in my own house. I will be seen. I will be chosen, not maintained, not managed, not tolerated. Chosen every day. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," he said, and then, because it was the most important word he had ever spoken, "Ilara." Her name, her own name in his voice, for what may have been the first time in 7 years. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first loosening of a door long held shut. They returned to Ashenvale 4 days later. She walked through the front doors differently. Not the careful, accommodating entrance of a woman making herself small enough to be acceptable, but the full, unhurried arrival of someone who has negotiated her right to occupy space. Mrs. Halford, standing in the entrance hall, pressed both hands to her mouth. She recovered quickly, but her eyes were bright. That evening they dined together, just the two of them, at the long table that had hosted 100 performances of a marriage that never quite was. The food was simple. The room was quiet. Halfway through the meal, without preamble, without announcement, he looked up from his plate and said her name again. "Ilara." She looked up. The word hung between them in the candlelight, an apology, a beginning, 7 years of silence finally, irrevocably broken. She held his gaze. And for the first time at that table in that house, in all the long years of their careful, wasted arrangement, She smiled at him. Not the practiced smile of a duchess performing contentment. Something real, something that cost her nothing because it came freely. Outside, the Ashenvale grounds lay quiet under a winter sky. Inside, the candles burned long into the night. She had released him. He had chosen, finally, to come back. And this time she had chosen too.